Now, let's actually do this same adding of fractions thing with some variables involved. I'd like you to follow these steps. It's a fairly straightforward process. First, see if either of your fractions reduce, because if they do, that can make your overall work process a little bit simpler. So is there anything to reduce in the first fraction? No. Is there anything to reduce in the second fraction? No. Okay, so most of the time, you're not going to be able to. Sometimes you will. If you do that reduction first. Next up, find your least common denominator. Here's what I recommend. I'm going to actually list here off to the side what I need. So take a look at just your numerical coefficients. So what I mean by that is no variables involved. Like if it was just a denominator of 2 and a denominator of 4, what would the LCD be? Well, it would be 4. So our LCD's got to have a 4 in it. And then just kind of go through the other variable stuff, and you've got to make sure that everything shows up. So if there's an n-1 in this denominator, there has to be an n-1 in your least common denominator. Your LCD will have every factor that shows up in either denominator to start with. So n-1, got to be an n-1 here. Here's your LCD. Next up, make the fractions have common denominators. So 4n-1, this one's already good. So the second fraction, nothing needs to change. It's already got the 4, it's already got the n-1. But the first fraction, it doesn't have everything we need. So it's got a 2. To turn a 2 into a 4, we need to multiply by another 2. And we also need this factor of n-1. This is what we mean by make the fractions have common denominators. Whatever you have to multiply in on the bottom, you must also multiply that same thing in on the top. That's exactly what we did up here, except it was just all numbers. Like when we did the 3 and 3 or the 2 and 2. Here, it's a 2n-1 and a 2n-1. Next up, let's simplify things a little bit. So on the top here, 5n times 2 would be 10n, and the 10n then distributes through these parentheses. So 10n times n is 10n squared. 10n times -1 is minus 10n, and that's over the common denominator of 4n-1. And then over here, n-3, 4, n-1. Once your denominators match, it's just a matter of putting all your like terms together. So 10n squared, there are no other n squareds. Minus 10n plus 1n is minus 9n, and plus -3 is a minus 3 on the back. You know you're finished when you've got everything in one fraction and things are as reduced as they can be. We'll do a quick recap. Before we do, though, now your answer key on the practice sheets won't list variable restrictions, but they still matter. I want you to make sure you didn't accidentally divide by 0 somewhere. The way you do that is by saying, hey, just so you know, n can be any number you want as long as it's not 1. Because if you use n equals 1, that would force us to have divided by 0. So I'm going to highlight that as well. Right, a recap. First, check to see if there's any reducing in either fraction. There wasn't. Next, find your LCD. This is generally one of the trickier parts. Between 2 and 4, the least common multiple is 4, and we need that factor of n-1 showing up as well. Make now your fractions have that common denominator. The second fraction already did, nothing to change. The first fraction needed an additional factor of 2 and n-1, so we did those on the bottom and on the top. The rest then was just simplifying the tops so we can add them together and including the restrictions on your variable. Let's do a few more examples, and then we will wrap this up. Step 1, check to see if there's any reducing that can be done ahead of time. There is this time. I notice here that 3 and 6 can reduce. This b and this b can reduce away. And divide by 2 over there, we now have a much simpler set of fractions to add together. Because if I didn't spot that, if I didn't check that reduction first, my LCD would have a lot of extra stuff in it that we just don't need. Okay, then, let's get our LCD. So thinking it through over here to the side, what do we need? Well, I'm looking at the first denominator. I need everything that's in that, so I need the a squared. I'm looking now at the second denominator. I need a factor of 3. There's your least common denominator. So in this first one, multiply by a 3 top and bottom. For the second fraction, by an a squared top and bottom. That'll then get us here. 2 times 3 is 6 over the LCD plus 2a squared over the LCD, and then just put it all together. 2a to the second plus 6 over 3a to the second. When you're doing your restrictions, we need to make sure that we don't actually let a be 0, but you also need to make sure you don't let b be 0. Well, there's no b here, right? Doesn't matter. There was a b to start with. So I like to always go back to the original and take a look at what was down below to decide what your restriction should be. Okay, then. There's your reduced expression. There's your restrictions. You're all set. Next up, if you're feeling confident, go ahead, do a quick pause, try this one on your own. Let's see, is there anything to factor? Nope, because there's no v plus 3 on the bottom. Now here, you could reduce the 6 and the 3, but I'm not gonna, and here's why. I know just from looking up here, I'm gonna have to have a 3v in my common denominator anyway. The LCD is gonna have a 3v in it, which means if I reduce that 3 away, the very next thing I'm gonna do is put it right back in. So this time, I'm actually not gonna reduce that fraction. What should our LCD be? Well, it's gotta have a 3v. It's gotta have a v plus 5. It's gotta have a v minus 3. So it must have every factor of that first denominator. It's also gotta have a 3v, but we've already got 3v listed. You don't need to list it again. If what this denominator needs is already here, that means we're good. I'm gonna move you over a little bit, fella. And let's now adjust. I need this denominator to match this one. It already does. Nothing to change. I need the second denominator to match this one, which means I need to multiply in this v plus 5 and this v minus 3. Next up is the simplification step. First fraction doesn't change at all. Now, just for space reasons, I want to do a little thinking off to the side here. We're focusing now just on the top of this second fraction. If we first multiply out the v plus 5 times the v minus 3, that's going to give us v squared minus 3v plus 5v for a total of plus 2v and a minus 15. If you're not comfortable doing that in your head, you don't have to. I would say set up one of these grids. Do that same thing. Add it all together, you're going to end up in the same spot. The final thing we'll do then is distribute the 6 through these parentheses. Hado, hado, hado. So 6 times v squared is 6v squared. 6 times 2v is 12v. 6 times 15 is 90. That's all over. Again, our common denominator. Okay, then last step, put it all together. This is addition, so I've got a 6v squared. V plus 12v's is 13v's overall. 3 plus negative 90 is minus 87. All over our common denominator of 3v, v plus 5, v minus 3. We're just going to make a note also, hey, make sure the v isn't 0 or negative 5 or 3. Put that all together and you are good to go. This is one of those things that falls into the category of not easy, but definitely manageable. As long as you keep track of what you're doing as you go, you should be in good shape. Okay, last one. Start off the same way. See, is there any reducing to be done? In this fraction, nope. In this one, L, but you can reduce the 2 and the 4. So 3y over 5x plus 1y over 2x to the third. Let's talk LCD. We're going to need a 5 and an x. We're going to need a 2. And now, overall, I need x to the third. Now, when you've got the same variable showing up more than once here, just pick the higher exponent. Because if I have x to the third, that takes care of the x that I need here. So put this all together, our LCD is going to end up being 10x to the third. Again, that little shortcut. When you have an x and an x to a different power in your LCD, just pick the highest power. That's going to have all the variables that you need. Let's adjust things here then. So to turn, I didn't leave enough space. Let's see how you divide it up here. Tell you what, we'll just kind of shove it in just a little space here. All right, so to turn a 5x into a 10x to the third, we need to multiply by 2x to the second. The reason it's x to the second is I already have x. So to get to x to the third, I only need an additional x to the second to make that happen. In the second fraction, we're just going to multiply by 5 on the top, 5 on the bottom. That'll take the 2 and make it a 10. So 3 times 2 is 6. X squared y over 10x to the third plus 5y over 10x to the third. Put it all together. These aren't like terms, so they don't combine other than just to write them beside each other with a plus in between. And our only restriction this time is that x can't be 0. We don't need to restrict the y at all because the y did not show up in the denominator. So there is our answer, there's our restriction, and we're all set.